Welcome to this lecture. I'm Dickin. I'm welcoming you on behalf of the Hamilton chapter of the Canadian Scientific Christian Affiliation, which is an affiliate of the American Scientific Affiliation and is concerned with the interaction between faith and science in the broad sense, which includes science, technology, medicine, social science, humanities, all of these scholarly fields. So on the left here, you can see the CSCA logo. And on the right-hand side, you can see the scholarly journal of the American Scientific Affiliation, with which CSCA is affiliated. And on the bottom right, you can see some of the locations of local chapters. And this is directed primarily at students to encourage students to join the CSCA for free, I believe. Okay, so specifically, I'm welcoming you today to the third in a series of 6 presidential lectures, which is to say lectures by past presidents of the CSCA. And this is in celebration of the 50th anniversary of the CSCA this year. And these 6 lectures are leading up, in a sense, to the ASA annual meeting. So the ASA annual meeting is of the American Scientific Affiliation. This year is in Canada at the University of Toronto, Mississauga, UTM, as we call it here, at the last 3 days of July. You can see it there on the screen. As you can see, the title of the theme is Moving Forward Together, the Future of Science and Faith. And of course, that intention to move forward together is set within the context of what our past achievements, and specifically, of course, of the 50 years of the CSCA. So that will be how the annual meeting will be like the culmination of this lecture series. And I also have to point out to any students that there are scholarships available to cover some of the costs of the meeting, not including travel, but other costs of the meeting. All right, so I'm very happy for this third of the past presidential lectures to introduce Jim Peterson, has had an illustrious career as a clinical ethicist. So James Peterson was the president of the CSCA while holding the endowed R.A. Hope Chair in Ethics to teach at both the medical school and the Divinity School College at McMaster University, and then at the endowed Schumann Chair to teach at Roanoke College and the Virginia Tech Carilion School of Medicine. Jim is an ordained minister prepared in clinical pastoral education. He's researched molecular and clinical genetics on a grant from the NIH. He earned his PhD in religious and philosophical ethics from the University of Virginia. He has served on the board of a hospice. He is currently the ethicist for the LewisGale Medical Center, consulting on policy, education, and clinical cases. He serves as the editor-in-chief of Perspectives on Science and Christian Faith, which we were showing on the screen a couple of minutes ago. PSCF, as it's popularly called, is the peer-reviewed journal of the American Scientific Affiliation, celebrating its 75th anniversary this year also. Jim was recently called to give expert testimony at the National Academies of Science and Medicine, and he's an elected fellow of both the American Scientific Affiliation and the International Society for Science and Religion. So it's a great pleasure to invite Jim to speak on Is MAiD making a bed we want to sleep in?
Well, thank you very much, Alan. When I see you broadcasting there from Hamilton, Ontario, I have many warm feelings. I appreciate the Hamilton chapter being our host for this meeting. Hamilton on Lake Ontario, halfway between Niagara Falls and downtown Toronto, very special place, especially because of McMaster University. When I was first recruited to McMaster, it was for an endowed chair called the Roy A. Hope Chair in Ethics. The local newspaper there and in Toronto, when they published my arrival there in the chair, listed it as the Ray of Hope Professor for McMaster University, which had kind of a nice ring to it. But I want to be sure to give all due credit to Roy A. Hope, who endowed that particular chair. All right, so going on to our thoughts for today. Dying is so much part of living that to live well, you need to be able to die well. We are constantly confronted with the loss of loved ones and people who are close to us. Dying is just very much part of what we have to deal with to live the best that we can. So to talk about a subject that's so important and so complex in the next few minutes, this is not going to be bumper sticker ethics, where everything is all no or all yes and can be summed up in a slogan. Actually, MAiD, medical aid in dying, really is a matter of life and death. And living through the end of life requires our best care and nuance. Thinking it through with clarity is just not simple. But I hope what we cover in the next few minutes will be helpful to all of us as we think this through carefully in our Lord. Okay, at first in Canada, medical aid in dying meant when care providers supported their patients with pain relief and presence to the very end. Even if the medical establishment couldn't bring about cure for a particular patient, it was always to care. And that's something that when we hear medical aid in dying, we might very well remember that and think of that as a crucial part of the medical profession, to support and care for each of us, whatever the circumstances, to the very end. More recently in Canada, though, that term medical aid in dying has been co-opted. It's been defined as when a physician gives a lethal prescription to a patient to use when they wish to. Such an act has traditionally been called physician-assisted suicide because it is suicide. It's intentionally ending your life, but in that case, using a medication or prescription that's been prescribed. Activists prefer the term MAiD to distance MAiD from suicide because we know that most people who attempt suicide never try it again. The desire to end one's life can feel overwhelming, but it's usually, in most cases, temporary. If you're concerned and think that an acquaintance, a colleague, a friend, a relative might be considering suicide, don't worry that if you ask them that you'll somehow plant the idea. On the contrary, do ask, are you thinking of hurting yourself? And if they are, help them get in touch with the many sources of help and concern that are professionally and personally available. You can make a world of difference at that crucial time. Again, because most people, as powerfully as they feel the desire to end their life, it's not something that continues if they can survive that short time. Now, sometimes it can be much more longly felt, but usually it's temporary. So, to be clear, as we're getting started, medical aid in dying does not refer to a competent patient's right to refuse a treatment that the patient does not think is worth it. Forcing an unwanted treatment on a competent patient is a form of battery and assault, even if the treatment appears to be needed to extend life. There are many people alive today in Canada from using CPR, cardiopulmonary resuscitation. Their heart has stopped, and a team starts to press very hard on the sternum to try to massage the heart underneath to keep some blood flow until more serious care can arrive. When you think about it, remember the sternum is there to protect the heart. And so to push on it hard enough to get it to move blood through it often involves cracking ribs, severe bruising. It's often quite painful. And so we're grateful for the method of CPR. I've trained on it myself. But there are some people who will say, at my particular stage in life, at the particular condition that I'm in otherwise, I don't want to put myself through that, especially at the end of life. And so we do have available DNR orders for do not resuscitate, where a person can express that they're not saying they want to be dead, but they are saying that they do not want to receive that particular treatment. That particular treatment is not worth it to them. And I think we need to honor that kind of direction, we should respect a person's right to their body and how it's treated, that if they do not want to be resuscitated in that way, that we would not force that upon them. That's not suicide. That's not saying I want to be dead. That's saying this is a particular treatment that's not worth it to me. All right, so further, to be clear, medical aid in dying is not hospice. Hospice is for patients who decide not to pursue cure anymore. There's no obligation to make the dying process as long and difficult as possible. But there are often people who still want care in order to be comfortable. They want to be awake to this important life experience, and they want to be with family and friends to the end. These are the three primary goals of hospice. That hospice wants to take in patients who are no longer going to pursue cure. They don't want DNR anymore, as an example. They don't want to make their dying process longer or more difficult. But they still want care to do three things: to be comfortable, to be clear, and to have company. So 3 C's to help you remember. To be comfortable, awake to their experience, and with family and friends to the end. We find that when people have those 3 things, comfort, clarity, and that they thrive in it, especially with company and family. And their last days can be good days. They can be days that are well spent. Hospice can be a beautiful part of life. For more context then, Oregon was the first government to make it legal for a physician to give a patient a lethal prescription, usually for propofol. And they put into place a whole series of requirements to make sure it wouldn't be abused. Number 1, that it had to be patient-initiated. They didn't want people to feel pushed or forced into considering physician-assisted suicide. And one of the key safeguards was that it had to be the patient who first brought up and asked for it. They also specified that the patient had to be at least 18, with a terminal illness and less than 6 months to live. It can be hard to know if a person has 6 months or more to live. So the expectation was that 2 physicians had to exercise their best judgment to that conclusion. And 18, of course, was used as an arbitrary chronological age, as we often have to do in the legal system, to have a clear, equal marker. And they had to have a terminal illness, and that this was not intended to end the life of someone who had a chronic disease. This was intended to allow a person to shorten the amount of time they spent in the dying process. They also said that patient requests twice orally and once in writing over a period of 15 days. Being aware that most people, when they feel suicidal, it's temporary, they wanted to make sure that if they're going to move away from that desire, that there was time for that to happen. So a patient had to request twice orally and once in writing over at least 15 days for this to be offered. Further, a physician had to explain alternatives, such as palliative care and hospice. We just talked about hospice. Palliative care doesn't mean that you're necessarily dying. It means that you're working with a specialist whose focus is on relieving pain. So you can be quite young with chronic pain and consult with a palliative care specialist. Further, two physicians had to ascertain that the patient had the capacity for this irreversible decision. Capacity is the ability to exercise your personal autonomy in a way that actually represents who you are and what you desire in your life plans. For that reason, capacity is always task specific. Nobody has the capacity to do everything. My guess is you probably have the capacity to drive a personal automobile, but for most of you, maybe not to fly commercial jet aircraft. Capacity is always task specific. And what one has to look at the task is how much is at stake and how complex it is. If the question is whether you want blue or green Jell-O with lunch tomorrow, that's a very low stakes, very low risk decision, and a very simple one. It's binary. But if you're being asked to decide about what kind of cancer therapy, and there could be radiation or chemotherapy or surgery, each one has different ramifications and results. That becomes quite complex, and much is at stake, and we would expect a higher level of capacity. Now, when you're making a decision like physician-assisted suicide, capacity has to be very high because it's, of course, an irreversible decision. We can't go back and fix it later. Because this is a decision that requires a high capacity, Oregon also required that a psychiatrist or clinical psychologist had to concur that the person making the decision had sufficient capacity and they were not compromised by a whole range of mental maladies, most commonly clinical depression, which might affect their ability to actually think through carefully what they truly do want. Oregon also required that the physician ascertains that there's no undue influence on the patient. This is an important consideration. There can be a potential heir anxious to get their inheritance. There can be a government official that's already short on supplied funds and knows that the choice between a $50 pill and $5,000 a day care would be much better of the former than the latter for their budget line. There are many ways there could be undue influence on this kind of a decision, and the physician is expected to try to ask enough questions and understand to avoid such undue influence. The physician is also required, actually, to encourage the patient to inform their family. The expectation is that if there are connections with family, there might be resources that could diffuse the desire to end one's life. A physician's not required to contact family, but is required to encourage the patient to do so. And no medical care provider or institution is required to participate. In medical care, we really want the providers and the patient to come to an agreement on what's best for the patient. And what the patient wants might not always be the first choice of the physician, but it has to be within the realm of what the provider thinks is good for their patient. If a physician listens to a heartfelt demand for diet pills from an anorexic, it's quite within their responsibility to say no. If the physician believes that a request for physician-assisted suicide will harm their patient, they should be able to say no. And institutions are conglomerations, associations of providers, which can also, as an institution, have a commitment to provide or not provide a particular service. So, at least for Oregon, they wanted to be explicit that no medical care provider or institution is required to participate. They also specified that the lethal drug is administered by the patient. This is a final check to make sure that the patient realizes that this is an action of their agency, not the medical establishment, and that it's really what they want. They're the one who takes up and swallows the particular medication. Well, since 1997, when Oregon put in place the first government-sponsored physician-assisted suicide availability, 8 more states have legalized MAiD with similar requirements. As you can see there in the list, from west to east, Hawaii, California, Washington, New Mexico, Colorado, New Jersey, Vermont, and Maine. It's interesting that there have actually been a number of states that have held a vote on this and decided against it, Pennsylvania and Massachusetts as examples. And there are states that have approved PAS and then, after experienced, undone the legislation. So this is a current list, but it's currently in flux, always in flux. So why have these 9 states made a provision for their citizens to choose physician-assisted suicide? Well, one of the main arguments is that it's the patient's life. It's your life to sustain or end. There's considerable power to that. It is your life. But we're not in isolation. We come into the world through a family. We often have family responsibilities. We have friends. We have communities. We have employers. We have colleagues. We're part of a whole set of connections with other people. And so I am concerned that if one says, well, you can do this because it's just your life to sustain or end, it's often more complicated than that. It's further often suggested that this is just to shorten the dying process. Because the way it's set up in the various states that authorize it south of the border, this is not for someone with a chronic condition or affliction. It's someone who's already in the dying process. And so that limits some of the risk that's involved in that someone's already dying. And this is to shorten the process that they're experiencing. That people should be able to choose to not be a burden for others. That often in the dying process, one needs a lot of help, physically, socially, financially, and that people express concern that they don't want to be a burden. One would hope that right now we're talking about the public sector, but eventually when we talk more about specifically a Christian take, that the same Christian movement that at the very beginning used to rescue babies left outside the city walls to be exposed and die, this Christian movement that often had its members stay during a time of pandemic to help those who were ill, that these are active concern actions to love your neighbor, to care for others, whatever their needs might be, and that they would not be seen as a burden. Another concern that has been prominent in the states that have authorized this is to allow people to maintain personal control. And certainly that's something that we started to strive for from an early age, and that we seek to maintain, and that can be put at real risk when one is in a dying process. And so personal control is something that's highly valued, understandably. To protect taxpayer and personal resources, we spend a large amount of our economy on people in the last months of life. One of the reasons for that is not only one organ system leading to the failure of another, but also we don't necessarily know that it's the end of life. And so we tend to seek rescue care, acute care, which is very expensive near the end. And that can wipe out a family's resources. The number one cause of bankruptcies in the United States financially is medical costs. Now, we don't worry about that as directly in Canada, but we still are concerned about money from taxpayers, which could have been spent on other very good ends. So to have a way to end a life directly and quickly, there's a tremendous financial incentive. To avoid intractable severe pain, and this always comes up. We would never allow our pets to suffer severe extended pain. Certainly we shouldn't allow people to. It's important to realize, though, that with modern medical resources, there's no reason for anyone to die in intractable pain. In the most severe cases, we might have to medicate all the way to unconsciousness. But usually, we have well within the medical armamentarium the availability of drugs that can relieve a person from pain, especially at the end of life when one is not as worried about issues with, say, addiction. We have drugs like morphine that are available that can, and the right dosage can help a person to be clear, awake, and comfortable, and able to interact with their company. So the concern about needing to have a physician-assisted suicide to remove pain is not as prominent with modern medications that are available. Well, so that's some of the reasoning that's gone into the 9 states that have made MAiD a legal possibility. But there are 41 states that consider MAiD a crime. Well, why is that? Some of the reasons they say is you're part of a family, a community, a society. Your life is not just your own to end at will. In Canada and in the US, we laud personal choice and seek to support autonomy and the ability to make decisions for oneself. But the emphasis here would be that it's not just oneself that is deeply affected by MAiD. It's interesting that one's perception of particular suffering often changes over time. We find that if you survey able-bodied people, and we're only temporarily able-bodied, and ask them, would they want to live on if they were quadriplegic? A very high percentage says no, that they wouldn't want to live that way. It's interesting, though, that if you survey people who are quadriplegic, again, a very high percentage says yes, they do find that life is worth living. And we have a similar situation when you ask people, would they want to keep living if they were somehow blinded? A large percentage of the population says no, they couldn't imagine living with blindness. But then if you survey people who have been blinded, almost all say that life can be and is good. So one of our concerns is that one might perceive that there is suffering coming that will be unbearable, and one will not want to live and would rather be dead. But then we find when the time comes, actually, they are quite happy to live. The concern was also raised that no one should have to justify living, especially when already vulnerable. By definition, we're talking about people who are entering a physically trying and difficult process. It's a terrible time to require them to justify the resources and the effort that's going into their continuing to live. And so the states that have outlawed this say that no one should be asked to have to justify living when they're already facing a difficult task. It's also been raised that life usually starts and ends significantly dependent on others. And so it's not contrary to dignity to need care. You and I all started with nothing entering our mouths that somebody else had not placed there for quite a long period of our developing life. We all tend to start needing a lot of care and help. We become more capable, and then there is a decline where we need more help as we go on. It's the natural human course. And so the states that have forbidden PAS have tended to say, look, it's just the natural course to need help when you're young and when you're old. And we're grateful for times in between with more independence, but it's not a lack of dignity or worth to need help. The states that have forbidden the practice have also been concerned to lessen the pressure to save money and effort. That it can be so expensive and time-consuming and difficult for care when one is in later stages, last stages of life, that they didn't want people to be pressured into decisions that they really didn't want in order to save money and effort. There was also concern expressed about undermining the medical profession's dedication to healing. That if physicians have the job of sometimes intentionally ending the life of their patient, that might make them more cavalier or more callous, less concerned about extending life. Now, of course, the response from the other side is that the medical profession should not be dedicated just to extending life. It should be dedicated to relieving suffering. And sometimes this might be the best way to relieve suffering. And then a further argument that's been raised against physician-assisted suicide or MAiD has been the danger of a conceptual or social slippery slope. Now, what do I mean by that? Sometimes it's described as indeed a slippery slope, the idea that you take the first step where you're still on top of the slope and doesn't seem like it's changed that much. But because it's slippery, you start to slide and you end up in a place you never intended. Sometimes that's described as the camel's nose under the tent. I spent some time with the Bedouin in the Negev desert, and I learned very quickly that if a camel, that can be quite curious, puts its muzzle under the edge of the tent to smell that strange scent of a foreigner inside, that even if you don't mind, you should whack it quickly with the palm of your hand or with a sandal, because if you don't, very quickly in the next few minutes, you'll get the whole camel inside your tent. And they're actually pretty big and don't smell so good. You really don't want them inside your tent. Another description would be the thin edge of the wedge, that maybe that first example doesn't seem so bad. The problem is what follows behind it. The category gets wider and wider. Now, I listed here conceptual and social slippery slope. That's because sometimes when people are concerned about a slippery slope, they think there's a conceptual problem, that once you've okayed taking one person's life, it's very hard to stop taking other lives, that there's no conceptual difference. Some say that there might be a good logical reason to stop, but there's a social slippery slope, that once you've crossed that first line, there'll be a personal and social momentum that will continue to grow. So there might be a good logical reason to stop, but people won't. Now, when I raise this example of this argument about a conceptual or social slippery slope, is a slippery slope in such a context really possible? Well, think about this example. There's a country that we highly regard where not that long ago, they said, if you're mentally able, you can choose to have your life ended. And then they said, isn't it just logical and appropriate that if you're unconscious and we can recognize for you that you would rather be dead, that we should then on your behalf carry that out? So if a patient, say in a coma, and every indication is they're not going to wake up, we can recognize on their behalf that they would rather be dead, and then carry that out, make sure that that happens. And if you're of a diminished capacity and want to live, we can recognize that if only you understood you would rather be dead, that the reason you want to live is because of your diminished capacity, due to mental illness, due to injury. In fact, this progression that I'm describing began in the medical institutions of the country. If you're of a diminished capacity and want to live, medical care professionals built a consensus. They agreed that they could recognize that if only you understood you would rather be dead, you would, so they would decide that for you. And if you're able and want to live, but perverse, we can recognize that you should be dead for your sake and for that of the society. And if you are able, but are part of a group that is a danger or a drag to society, we can choose death for you. Now, this is the very progression that we saw in the same country that gave us Bach and Beethoven and Brahms, and eventually systematically murdered more than 8 million people. So, can a slippery slope happen culturally in regard to the lives of its citizens and whose lives are worth living? We have actually seen this slippery slope in a highly respected and important country. There are people still alive who lived through this very process. In 2016, Bill C-14 made Canada one of the few countries in the world to officially make medical aid in dying legal. Within regulations, Switzerland has not prosecuted individuals assisting suicide since 1942, and associations since 1985. Even today, legally in Switzerland, if a physician takes part in assisting suicide, they do so as a citizen. In 1994, the Netherlands declared that physician-assisted suicide would not be prosecuted, but quite deliberately kept it illegal until 2001. The strong commitment at the time of saying they would not prosecute physician-assisted suicide was that they did not want to say that this was something society thought was a good idea or a helpful option, just that they were not going to criminally prosecute it. And that's indeed, as I said, the way it remained for a number of years. In 2001, that provision was removed, so it became legal, but certainly not something that the government of Netherlands has encouraged. Belgium legalized physician-assisted suicide in 2002. Now, the requirement in Canada in 2016 was quite similar to those in Oregon, with some substantive differences. For example, the decision has to be reaffirmed over 10 days, not 15, and the medical professional can directly administer a substance that causes death. It's interesting. Our Canadian experience has been that almost everyone who asks for medical aid in dying asks the physician to actually administer the lethal substance. I expect that's probably because it emphasizes that they're perceiving this as a medical procedure and that it is in some sense approved by the medical establishment, that a physician is willing and indeed is the one who actually administers the substance. That's a safeguard in Oregon and in most other states, that it's the recipient who does it in the last minute. But in Canada, the procedure has been to allow the medical professional to do it, and that's been what almost everyone has chosen. As of 2023, more than 30,000 Canadians have used such a lethal prescription. That is 3.3% of deaths nationally since it became legal. And interestingly, 7% of the deaths since then in Vancouver. Now, this is a moving target to talk about in Canada. Here is a screen capture from one of the Canadian government sites that is dealing with the regulations. And do you notice that these are a publication of regulations amending the regulations for the monitoring of medical assistance in dying from November 9th, 2022. It's a moving target. This keeps changing. So with that caveat, those concerned with a slippery slope note that Canada has now passed in 2021 C7 that removes yet more of the initial safeguards. The requirement that the patient have a terminal illness. A Mr. Trutchen had cerebral palsy, not lethal, but cerebral palsy, devastating disease. And a Ms. Gladue had post-polio syndrome. Neither condition was lethal, but the court in Quebec ruled that they too should be able to kill themselves with medical help, in that if those who were terminal could end their lives, those who were not terminal should be able to. So put aside the safeguard, the risk management of saying that this was only available to those who were trying not to prolong the dying process. C7 also says that a patient can receive MAiD while mentally ill. So the safeguard of not being clinically depressed is not necessarily in place in the current Canadian system. C7 also talks about mature minors, those who are not 18, but are mature in many ways, might be recognized and actively considered as old enough to kill themselves. And no 10-day reflection period. There's a 3-month delay if one is not dying, but even that is a shorter period than many waiting lists for housing or psychiatric care. And so a real concern is if people are crying out for help, if they are seeking to have their life ended because they just can't put it together, but they could have if housing or psychiatric care was available. Do we want to let those people end their lives? Well, moving from public conversation that Christians should be part of to some specifically Christian perspectives. We're very aware in the Christian tradition that sin distorts our perception and action. So accountability is essential. To have systems in place that recognize that people can act for the wrong reasons or can make bad choices is just part of recognizing human nature, our condition, our society, where things can and do go wrong. And that we need to be sensitive to and aware of that and to try to proceed in something that's so irreversible in a way that recognizes where sin can distort. Also, in the Christian tradition, human beings are not inherently immortal. But for God's children, there is the promise that God will grant the gift of eternal life with God. Hence, death will be a transition to the next and better life. You may be familiar with a famous text, John 3:16, that says, "For God so loved the world, he gave his only Son, that whosoever believes in him shall not perish," as would be the norm on our own, but rather receive with him eternal life. Paul took this so seriously in Philippians 1:21 that he says, "For me to live is Christ, to die is gain." This is a perspective in the Christian tradition that can't help but dramatically affect how one looks at these end of our earthly physical life decisions. So the premier question then, as for the rest of life, is how at the end of life, in this kind of decision, how one can best serve God. And the second question is how in this too, one can love one's neighbor as oneself. We're expected to use these two primary measures through all of life, including end-of-life decisions. So I would suggest, if it's legal, that implies that society thinks it is sometimes a good choice. And that can make it too easy to avail yourself of that particular way out. It can even become eventually expected by friends or family, by society, by the institutions, by the government. I'm very concerned that when a country makes this legal, it gives a momentum to it, that it can make it too easy, even eventually expected. I'd suggest that it's better to leave it illegal, such as suicide is illegal in most jurisdictions, but not prosecuted if certain standards are met. I do want to emphasize that hospice, will almost always be the best way to live as fully as one can one's last days. And in fact, most people who are comfortable, clear, and with company in hospice are happy to live out that way all the days that they can. And I do want to say that sustaining the body is our normal responsibility, but not an absolute. It was clear at Gethsemane that Jesus was not seeking death, but he was willing to fulfill his calling, which was more important than his normal duty to sustain and protect his body. My body should end here as much in God's presence and service as my life that preceded and that life that will surpass this earthly existence. Well, there's so much more to think about. I've tried to get clear on some of the key definitions, on a whole range of the major arguments that have been made in this regard. And that's been more than enough to digest and consider. All I see on my screen right now are slides. I'm going to try to switch over to pictures of those who are present. I expect that for something like this that's going to appear on our website as a recording, that most people who will watch this will do it asynchronously. But I'm delighted for those of you who are present and would love to hear some of your comments, questions, challenges. Let's go ahead and open up to some conversation.
Thank you so much, Jim. And okay, we have a question there. And
fantastic talk. Thank you, Dr. Peterson. One question, you said near the end that something about accountability is necessary. And I wasn't quite sure the point you were making. This was at the beginning of talking about the Christian attitude to suicide.
Yeah, no, I appreciate your highlighting that. My concern there is that we not depend on people to make this kind of a decision alone. That even if you're primarily responsible for your own body and self, we recognize as Christians that our perception, our understanding, our desires are affected by sin. They're distorted. They're not always accurate. They're not always right. They're not always for the best. And that as Christians, we need to listen to one another. We need to consult with one another. That it's appropriate to have government requirements, that certain things have to be met because they're so easily abused. That I want to encourage that kind of a dialogue for the individual and for society to come to a better end than if we tried to do it in an isolated way by ourselves. Is that what you're thinking about?
Yes. Okay. So this is the converse. Yeah, when you said some states have voted against it because there is a slippery slope, we might decide that although he's unconscious or incapable, he ought to want to die, and therefore he should die. And this is the converse, that we might feel that he is sinful or misled, and so he ought to want to live. Is that fair?
Well, that's why I suggested that we need to work together and to hold each other accountable to try to make better decisions. And part of that trying to make better decisions, I would argue, would include not writing off people simply because they're sinful. So that's the love of God and love of neighbor that kicks in. Yes.
Thank you.
Oh, sure.
We have a question from Robert.
Robert, what's up?
Yeah, hi, thanks. Very interesting talk. Rather, what's the right word? Measured tone, shall we say, for something I consider disturbing. I'm most concerned in this country by the slippery slope argument. Would you say Canada is sliding down one? And if so, what would be the best way for Christians to respond? And if not, what would be the best way for Christians to respond?
Right. No, I did. You're very perceptive. I was trying to communicate, as you say, in a measured, here are the facts, here's what we know, here's what's happening, that I think people have justified reason to be concerned about a slippery slope, in that when Canada legalized, I do think Canada was the first country as a country to make this decision. And that, so it's ahead of the game for most places. Usually people cite the Netherlands as the first country, but the Netherlands still hasn't legalized physician-assisted suicide. So Canada came to it very early compared to other countries, in the vast majority of which it's still not accepted. And when Canada did weigh in, they dropped a whole series of the safeguards that were put into place by the governments that had okayed it before. So it's much easier. There's less in the way of safeguards in Canada than in the other countries that do allow it. And that in the short time we've had since Canada okayed it, Canada's already started rolling back the few requirements that it had. So the trend is definitely to make it easier and easier to access, to make it more and more widely available. How far will that go and what will it go to? I don't know. But the trend is already happening, and I am concerned that there's a momentum there. Now, what can you as an individual Christian do about this situation? What any other citizen can do? You can talk with your representatives in Parliament. You can vocalize and talk with other people. You can look for ways to reach out to and help people who are considering physician-assisted suicide, to see if maybe they don't so much want to be dead as much as they want to live differently. And there might be something in their life that we should help them to deal with. I think there are a whole series of things that as an individual we can do when we look at this situation. What, any of that persuasive or not? What do you think?
Well, partly, but one feels that this thing needs collective action on the part of Christians. And I know the Evangelical Fellowship of Canada does some things, but it seems, I guess, not as much as I think there should be, but maybe I'm missing something. Anyway, others have questions, so I will defer.
Okay.
Hey, Patrick, we have a question from you, I think.
Hi there.
Oh, so good to see you, Patrick.
Good to see you too, and thanks for your talk. I missed the first part of it. I'll have to catch the recording later, but I was happy to be able to come in and see a good chunk of it. So thank you for this, and it's a very relevant topic for all of us today. I think in our churches even, and in our families, of course. I'm just wondering if you've had any pastors come to you, or if you've had any conversations. I had somebody mention to me recently, as a pastor in a fairly conservative, so I mean, you know the Fellowship Baptists because you're up in Canada. So within that denomination and in his congregation, he's had to walk through MAiD with I think 5 people in just the last year. And he's wondering what to make of this, how to respond as a pastor. What's your sense of what we need to be doing in the church, maybe to is it that people need practical options? Is it that they need teaching around some basic convictions around value? Do you have a sense of that? I know this guy that I'm talking to, he's just he's unsure of what to do, right? So part of it is a scenario where people are considering it. Other times they've just decided. And so then what do you do as a pastor as you walk with people through that? Some would push it to the point of, some kind of celebratory thing. He's not in that camp, but yeah, just wondered about any insights in terms of pastors in the midst of this in the church.
Oh yeah, important. So much of pastoring is being with your congregants. And so there's a tremendous expectation and desire to be with your congregants in whatever they're going through. So I very much hear that. If you think that there is a situation that would be as harmful and destructive as, say, divorce, how do you accompany somebody who is going through a divorce? There are ways you can support and encourage without saying this is the right thing to do. And we also want to work ahead to support marriage, to help our people not get in that situation. And I think there's a parallel here. Sit down your congregation and show them this recording that we just created, right? Where you really walk through what people have argued on the different sides and have a heart-to-heart and talk through it together. I think there are situations where the community can gather together and where individuals take responsibility before God, that they would be much more likely, for example, to end up in hospice than in a MAiD situation. Is MAiD always wrong for a Christian? I said that the body is not an absolute. I can imagine that one might face a situation where, say for example, the particular case that kicked off the change in legislation in California was a young woman by the name of Brittany Maynard, who at 29 had just gotten married and joyous occasion and excellent health, was diagnosed with brain cancer. And it was a brain cancer that really couldn't be treated. It was very clear that she just had a few months to live. And she came to a point where she realized that the natural course was that she was going to go into dementia of a rather severe limit, so that there would be a point where her body might be breathing and her heart might be pumping, but in a very real sense, she would have already left. And at that point, do we have an obligation to keep the heart pumping as long as possible? Or might it be appropriate to still the heart? I didn't want to rule that out as a possibility. So there are going to be cases, there's just such a range of what our people face. We want to be with them, we want to listen, we want to help them think things through while there's time to think. And then there's going to be a variety of what's the best way to disciple and accompany as a pastor when the time comes. So not one blanket yes or no always from my perspective. You're so thoughtful about these things, Patrick. Where am I missing it or need to tune it up better, or what do you think?
No, I think that's really helpful. I'm not sure I have much to add, but appreciate your response and just your comment about sensitivity, knowing the context. Because it's one thing, as you've been talking about, to not have proper safeguards in place and to begin. We certainly wouldn't want it to be the case in the church that you start to feel like life is not worth living for certain groups of people. But I appreciate your comments about individual cases. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, maybe this is the last question from Arnold.
Arnold, good to see you too.
Sure, thanks. Good to see so many past presidents on this call. I think there's 5 of us. Thank you for an inspiring, informative talk, Jim. Really appreciate that. I wonder if you can say anything more about palliative care, which I guess is very closely connected to hospice, which is maybe the context in which palliative care is done. But it seems to me that within Canada, we are not promoting palliative care very much. A number of years ago, there was a member of parliament, Mark Warrow, who's actually the representative for riding near us, and he was a graduate also of Trinity Western University, and he was dying, and he spoke in parliament about how it seemed very hard for him, as someone with quite well, had good means to do so, but for him to access palliative care was actually quite challenging. And I wonder what it is about our country and perhaps about palliative care itself. Like, how well known is it among the medical community? Why is it not more of a default to give good palliative care? Can you say anything about that? Thanks.
Wow. It's not a one-off issue. We also have a tremendous shortage, for example, of psychiatrists. I mean, there are many specialties, that are desperately needed, and we don't have enough people to do what should be feasible and should be available. This starts to become a political question. Does our province put more money into palliative care or building a bridge or primary education? It's that push and pull is there all the time. As far as accessing the palliative care that we do have, there's no question that hospice says that it exists to make it possible for people to be comfortable. That's one of the big 3 C's: comfortable, clear, and with company. So comfort's extremely important. A hospice should be good at it. It gets complicated in a place like hospice. Some of the medications that are actually not expensive, but very effective, like morphine, we use liberally in a hospice situation because it is inexpensive, it is effective, and we're not worried about addiction. So there's no worry about you're going to have a lot of trouble getting off this later. The thing with morphine, though, is the dose of morphine that will relieve your pain after you've been taking it for a week would have been lethal on the first day. So it does take genuine expertise to keep adjusting the dose so that you get comfort and clarity without shortening the person's life. So it does take some skill. Now, the other distinctive I want to be careful about is before you enter hospice, you have to say, I'm about care and not about cure. I'm swearing off on aggressive attempts to cure. You can have palliative care without making that promise at all. Palliative care is a medical specialty to relieve pain. It's crucial to hospice, but it can occur completely separately from hospice. Now, you have some hospitals that will have palliative end-of-life care that's available in the hospital that does not do all of the largely Christian-oriented things that hospice does and that are associated with end-of-life. But if you send a high school football player to the hospital to see the palliative care specialist because of chronic knee pain, you don't have to worry that you're signing him up for end of life. It's a different discipline. So connected but distinctive.
Right. Well, thank you so much, Jim, and to everyone for participating. And I think we'll say goodbye now. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks again.
Goodbye. See you at the next one.